Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamed in Highland Park, New Jersey, the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation. And joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanowski, Hazak Hazak, New York City, Rabbi Barry Chesler coming to us live from Ocean City, Maryland, but normally from Solomon Schechter Day School of Long Island. It's great to see you. We haven't seen each other for a couple of weeks because we recorded Pinchas a week earlier. But it's great to be back together and thinking about the future. You know, we are planning to be at Machane Ramah in the Berkshires, where we are broadcast on Kol Ramah 102.3 FM. And we want to thank Mitch Mernick for dutifully producing us and uploading us and putting us on the website. And we hope to be there live next week on Clergy Day, or Educator Day, or whatever day it's called, and
Wednesday.
We hope that we'll have a live audience. You think that we will have we'll be able to do this with a live audience? That's just so amazing. Let's
be honest. Even if we don't have a live audience, the fact that the three of us can get together and do it in person is going to be pretty sweet.
That's amazing. We're looking forward to that. We'll have to get a real camera here in one screen. At any rate, Bli Neder, without promising, which is a good segue to our Parshiot, Matot Masei, double Parsha with the first of the two, Matot. At the beginning of this Parsha, it deals with the Neder, and I use the word Bli Neder. Bli Neder means, you know, we commit ourselves, and it's a nice Jewish way of saying, but I really don't want to commit myself fully with a executable oath here, a vow, because if I do so and I don't fulfill it, then I might receive a penalty for that. And perhaps the word Bli Neder, the phrase Bli Neder, which is seeped into the way Jews talk, takes into account the very special nature of language, that words, when we say things, we mean things, and words within biblical culture and maybe within, pre-modern culture, words had a lot of meaning to it. Words had a lot of weight. Barry.
So, in a sense, the vow is a reminder that even with speech, which we seem to think that we can repeat or refine to our heart's content, you don't get do-overs. When you say something, you obligate yourself to what you say. And in our Parsha, of course, there are two of the exceptions are for a woman in her father's domain or in her husband's domain. The father or husband can overrule the vow, which raises some interesting issues about how women are regarded, because if you can't take a person at their word, their value is diminished.
Well, it really is a very interesting passage, because obviously what is being described, a minor female in her father's house or a married woman, they are, what is being described is clearly a hierarchical, stratified social system where she does have a rather limited authority over her own words, but not totally limited, because the father and the husband in those cases each must, on the day that they hear of the vow, revoke it if they want to revoke it, but then they lose their ability. So they have like a one-day reaffirmation that they're the boss and that she kind of works for them or she's under their control. And so yeah, she's not what we would consider fully autonomous, but she's not, a tool of his desire either, right? He has some authority over her, but the authority is limited.
Right. Well, the other piece that may be part of it is that these particular vows that the Torah is talking about may be vows that have a monetary component to them, so that when the woman makes the vow, she's actually obligating the resources of either her father or her husband, and they have to pay up.
So that would, on the note, the Bible does have some accounts of vows. Jacob makes a vow when he leaves Canaan and goes to sojourn with his.
Well, that was a business deal.
It was by Yidor Neder Ladonai. He makes a vow to God, and it says, if I go and I'm able to come back, I'll give you a tenth of whatever I get here, and that's a promise. And then there's Yiftach, great judge, also known as Jephthah, Yiftach, who says, I'm going to sacrifice the first thing that comes out after returning victorious from a battle, and lo and behold, it's his daughter. And he doesn't revoke his vow. It's a very peculiar episode in the Book of Judges, and he is, I guess, certainly by the tradition, condemned for that. But I think there's a slight condemnation in the text itself against Yiftach. I mean, this is weird. This is strange. This is,
it is
in trouble.
First of all, I wanted to just say that I would pick up on, what you were saying about the just huge importance of speech. Speech creates a reality, and even today we have different ways in which speech creates a reality. You take an oath of office, you take an oath when you go to the court. I can lie without consequence, but if I take an oath in court, and then it's perjury, right? And you say certain things under a chuppah, and until you do that, you're not married. But then you say them, and you're married. And so speech does create a reality. There's a wonderful. We got really, really lucky here at Anshe Chesed, and the creator, Asaf Beiser, the co-creator of the Yehudim Ba'im comedy sketch show in Israel, spoke at the synagogue here the other night.
Oh,
and
wow!
It was great. It was so good. But the last episode of the previous season, there's a lot of shows. There's a sketch show that mines biblical stories and episodes of Jewish history, and a lot of them have been about Moshe. And the last episode of the last one was, Moshe is finally retiring, and Joshua's thing is pushing him out the door. It's quite funny. And so they're going to be done with Moshe because they concluded the season with him. But he's sort of paraphrasing his way through the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments. And I want to make sure you know the Ten Commandments. The people don't know any of the Ten Commandments.
Sure.
But don't eat wool with the mother's milk or something like that. And they screw them all up. And so he repeats them, but he repeats them in a colloquial and very sweet language. And one of them about Lo tisa et Shem Adonai Elohecha lashab, don't take God's name in vain. Don't say God's name stam, just pointlessly. In fact, don't say anything stam. If you want your words to matter, choose them carefully and really mean them.
Yeah,
and I thought that was just so beautiful.
Oh,
that was just great. Don't say anything stam. You're creating a reality when you make these vows.
Are they going to
about this, which is really interesting, is that one of the things that the rabbis they really care about this is the chachamim, sages, are empowered to dissolve a vow if the person didn't know what they were getting into, which does not exist in the Torah. And in fact, in the Mishnah itself, it says that this is harim tzulim b'sa'ara. It's
Parchin bavir.
You're mountains hanging by a hair, or
no, that's Hilchot Shabbat. Heter nedarim parchin bavir.
Okay, it floated in the air with no basis. But yet the rabbis thought that they basically invented it.
They invented the fact that you could annul a vow, and that you could, or you can neutralize it, basically nullify it.
Right, but the real punch to that is that they still take Yiftach to task for not getting the vow annulled, even though the annulment didn't become possible for
and the midrash I saw on is also takes Pinchas to task, because Pinchas he should have overruled him and didn't, and so therefore Pinchas. But we said enough about Pinchas last time.
No, actually, a nice little story. I was in my shul, and one of learning not Parasha Shavua, but some Torah with someone who comes in frequently, and he happens to listen to the show. Wow. And he said, in my yeshiva, they didn't let us ask questions like that about Pinchas.
Well, there's value to us in that there are no questions that are out of bounds here, except, I don't know, we don't discuss Baal worship in depth here. Okay.
We don't discuss it in depth. Just, like,
We skimmed the
Part of how we
surface.
get into this. Okay. And I think we're going to skip over the massacre of the Midianites, right?
yeah,
I don't.
that's hard. That's in those pimps category questions.
It's a difficult passage, and not that we want to skip over difficult passages, but well, let's go to Masei, okay? And at the beginning of Masei, we all noticed that Masei, in the past we've talked about it in rhapsodic terms, and that the list of all the places that Israel stays reads almost like a song. But there's a little piece of information that's at the beginning of chapter 33. It says, I'm going to pick it up from 33:3. They went from Ramses on the first of the month of the 15th day in the first month. On the day after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with a high hand before the eyes of all Egypt. Then verse 4. Umitzrayim mikabrim et asher hika Adonai bahem kol bechor. And the Egyptians were burying those whom God had struck among them, every firstborn, and God had made judgments on their gods. Uve Elohim asa Adonai shvatim. That little note, it's almost like a footnote. Umitzrayim mikabrim et asher hika Adonai bahem. The Egyptians were burying. That's not in the text. I don't recall that from Shemot. I don't recall that as a specific thing. And so, here, do your Rashi on this for me, Barry.
So I think that what we have here is a kind of biblical midrash.
Yeah.
The verse before ends Leinei Kol Mitzrayim, in the presence of all the Egyptians. And what this verse reminds us is that the Israelites saw the Egyptians on their way out, but the Egyptians didn't see them because they were busy doing something else. And it provides a fascinating coda to the whole enslavement piece, because while the Israelites are slaves, the Egyptians don't see them as people. And when they leave, they don't even see them at all.
The Israelites don't see the Egyptians.
No, the Egyptians don't see them at all. The Israelites see the Egyptians as they're leaving.
Okay, the Israelites.
The Egyptians don't see them because they're busy mourning their dead.
So, but you said, so who doesn't see whom as people?
The Egyptians, my belief, deeply seated belief, is that people who own slaves do not, no matter what they protest, see the slaves as people in any meaningful way.
Interesting.
They're just a lower status. Although you don't enslave people the same status as you, unless you're even more evil than I can imagine.
Jeremy, you want to pick up on the, just give me your, Barry said this and you say this on Mikabrim. Is there?
So I feel like this verse I find very kind of gripping, because first of all, just in the art of the narrative,
yeah,
it doesn't say, and they left on the next day after God smote the. It could have said like after, and so it was after God smote the Egyptians that the Israelites left, but it didn't tell it that way. It told it with a very vivid image, like Israel is marching out into freedom, and Egypt is like hunched over in a graveyard digging, right? So I thought that was just like on a narrative level, a spectacular choice of facts, had detail. All good writing is always good in the details, and so that's an example here. And I kind of want to say what I want to be the case, which I don't really think is the case. I mean, clearly there is a contrast being drawn in this verse between the celebrating Israelites and the mourning Egyptians. I kind of want it to be generous and like I have a moment of empathy for the Egyptians burying their children. I don't really think it is, though. I think it's probably a little bit more like, come see the victorious and the vanquished.
So
there's a word in the Psalms, bekosharot. God takes out the suffering, bekosharot, and the Midrash refers to this verse. It's bacho, the Egyptians were crying, visharot, the Israelites are singing, and so you could imagine the sound of the singing of the Israelites singing like in Prince of Egypt, mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, and the Egyptians mourning their dead. It's kind of heartbreaking.
Well, you're saying that this is a triumphalist reading, and maybe I'll put in a voice for maybe this is an empathic reading. Maybe
I would like that to be the case. Please,
so,
please.
why so I want to say let's go there. Let's say that this is this is a verse that seems almost disruptive to the flow of the different verses here. And if it's part of the flow, great. If it's an editor saying, wait a minute, all of this joy in your departure, all of this joy and freedom is entailed catastrophe for the Egyptians, and the humanity of Israel at this point is mindful. That is to say that the people are attentive to the tragic outcome for the Egyptians, and that not only is there was it catastrophic for them, but it's mikabrim et asher yikabem kol bechor. They're all every firstborn. They're bearing children, and I don't know how you read that without feeling a sense of, wow, this is pretty.
So, in light of the passage that we passed over about the Midianites, it also seems to be a comment on them as well. Because we imagine after the battle with the massacre of the Midianites, that they're busy burying their dead while the Israelites are exalting and leaving, right? They're not staying at the battle scene. And so it sort of works for both stories.
Right. So it just tells us that, I love the fact that the Torah has trop, and that you can sing the Torah, and you even with the melody that you use, or the pauses that you use, or the tone of voice that you use, you can have different melodies, even with the same trop, and this verse can can be interpreted either triumphally or empathically.
Well, so Elliot, the note on Mikabrim is a riviyah, which goes down. It's a descending note.
Kabri.
So we can imagine the Egyptians descending in their grief as well.
Sure. But we don't go as far as to say you have to chant this in Eicha or anything like that. Look, for the most part, it's passed over in our reading, but it's saying, your journeys involves catharsis and tremendous disruption, and out of the death comes your life, basically. And so we go on to the different places that they stay, and we've talked about that in the past, and I truly love the interpretation that there's some music here. In fact, we do chant this with a different melody in certain traditions, because it is a song, and this is the song line of the wandering. Let's go a little further. I want to talk about the cities of refuge, okay, and that's in chapter 35. Chapter 35, we get into verse 9. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God speaks to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, when you cross the Jordan to the land of Canaan, you shall establish cities. They shall be cities of refuge for you." In the Hebrew, it's Vikritem lachem arim are miklat tiena lachem. They will be cities of refuge. V'nas shama rotzeach maken nefesh bishkaga. So which means a manslayer. A manslayer who strikes a life by mistake shall flee there. Nas shama rotzeach maken nefesh bishkaga. A tragic situation where we can imagine all sorts of different scenarios. We have the scenario of someone who is chopping wood, and the head of the axe flies off the head of the axe. These are situations where anticipating that accidental manslaughter will happen, and many lives in our communities are touched by these kinds of things, or accidental death or accidental homicides. vehicle accidents or other kinds of mishaps, engineering mishaps where buildings collapse, or you name it, dozens and dozens of scenarios. And these situations are impossible. They're impossible to manage. They're impossible for the family of the victim, certainly, and to a certain extent, they're impossible for the families and the individuals who, through either accident or negligence, commit these terrible acts. Then nobody's life can be the same. And so, in the context of ancient culture, the family of the victim wants to avenge the death, but the society provides a refuge for them. And there's something very captivating about the idea that you have some place to run, you have a place to go to. I don't know if how you want to comment on this or think about this.
I think that as you said, in the Asian context, like any decent family member would avenge their family member's death by killing somebody else. Like any decent person would be a goel hadam, be a blood avenger. And the Torah, sometimes the Torah is, when it legislates, sometimes it's describing an ideal world, and sometimes it seems to be describing a reform in which people's, worst instincts get out of hand and they have to restrain them. So the goel hadam, like, that was just a feature of the ancient world, and what they seem to be saying now is there's like a couple of functions that the Ir Miklat has. First of all, the person flees there. Ad omdo lifnei ha'edah mishpat. The first thing they do is they take him there to go to jail to await trial, and jail is like, it's not pleasant to be. The verb that the rabbis use for what happens when you go to the city of refuge is that you are exiled. So it's presumably not that pleasant to go there, but it's pretty good because it'll prevent the goel hadam from getting you in the meantime. So then they bring him back for the trial, and then either A, execute him because he's guilty actually of murder, or B, send him back to the Ir Miklat, the city of refuge, because he was really only manslaughter, it was an actual accident. Or C, they might determine that it was a total act of God that nobody could have ever foreseen. Like, some people don't get to go to the Ir Miklat because they're actually guilty of murder. Some people don't need to go to the Ir Miklat because, nobody in a million years could be held responsible for this freak accident that happened. But the people who go have stood trial and found to be at least a little bit criminally negligent.
It's such an interesting way of navigating through what is a chaotic situation. There's no way of explaining accidents except through the laws of physics, I guess. I mean, you can say gravity is a feature of our existence, and things will fall on you, and if you do not build a building properly, or if you do not fasten your axe head, the centripetal force of the axe will knock off the thing, and if you're in the way of it, you could get killed. I mean, those are not comfortable things.
This is why among the interesting things about this, as you pointed out, there was just a feature of the world that there was bloody vengeance, but the Ir Miklat comes as a reform to restrain the unlimited use of the goel hadam, but it doesn't eradicate the goel hadam, because if the manslayer is foolish enough to leave the city of refuge, then we're back in free zone for the blood avenger to kill him. So I feel like we're watching the Torah in this passage in Numbers 35. I feel like we're watching the Torah wrestle with the morality of the prevailing ethos of its time. Like, goel hadam, this is what we do. This is how we handle violence. Yeah, but it's got to be limited. We have to dial it back a little bit.
Sure. the hovering
And-
in
but
But
the,
it also,
Yeah,
I mean, it is a restriction on the Goel Hadam. It limits his field of action, so to speak. But it also seriously circumscribes the life of the Horeg Bishgaga, the unintentional murderer, because this person is displaced. Because just like with the vows, words have consequences, our actions have consequences. And I think it's arguable whether the ancient world really knew of an accident the way that we know of one, where no one is actually held responsible. Because the import of the law seems to be that the person is negligent, not totally not responsible. In other words, in our world, if you're negligent, that has liability. If it's actually an accident, there is no liability. And it's hard to imagine the ancient world perceiving a situation where there was no liability. But I want to add one other thing, because the way the chapter is constructed, we think about the Goel Adam, we think about the Horeg Bishgaga, but the whole justification for this rite concerns the land. That we have this ritual so that the land not be polluted, because all blood must be avenged. And if the blood is not avenged, the land will be lost. And
Yeah.
so this is a purification ritual of sorts. And what it teaches ultimately, I think, is that the responsibility of all of our actions is collective. It's not just individual, that the whole society has a stake in seeing that justice takes place in the correct form.
I think there's another valence here, which is that there is a situation in both ancient culture and to a certain extent to this day of sanctuary, or that the sacred area is a place of refuge, and it can become a place of refuge even for undesirables, for criminals. People will seek asylum in a church or even a synagogue. People will seek, certainly in antiquity, they sought asylum in a sacred area, maybe as a way of kind of delaying their punishment, but they would have that ability to kind of profess immunity when they were located in the sacred precincts. We have a biblical story about this with Yoav. Yoav, who was basically the henchman for David, a man with no shortage of blood on his hands, and when it came time, Solomon took the throne. Basically, it was we got to deal with all David's unfinished business, and Yoav, who knew that he had some blood on his hand, ran and held on to the horns of the altar in order to have asylum, basically. And at that point, they say, no, that's not going to happen. And they basically kill him there. They execute him there.
Well, but the way the story goes, and there's an important point here, is that he's told to come out of the altar, and he says, I'd rather die here.
Well, it could be over my dead body, basically, or
yes. But in other words, so I think there's still an element of purification at work, because even Yoav, who is the consigliere of King David, has a great deal of blood. And the other thing I would like to add here is that the stories that we have in the beginning of Kings, where Solomon is going to avenge his father, so to speak, also teaches us an important lesson on the meaning of words. Because the reason why David could not avenge these people is he made certain promises to them.
Interesting.
That he would not kill them while he was alive.
I want to make two observations that I'll put out there for your debate, which is, it's very interesting that this is either the last or close to the last thing that Moses legislates, because we are ending the book of Bamidbar, and of course, once we get next week to the book of Dvarim, it's Moses' valedictories, and while there are lots and lots of commandments in the book of Dvarim, this is really the end of the legislation in the desert. Okay, very interesting that Moses would be interested on the subject of manslaughter and a refuge when one could argue that Moses committed that act himself at the very beginning of his identity formation. That when he goes out among his people, among his brethren, he sees the Egyptian smiting the Israelite, and he looks this way and that way, and he smites the Egyptian. I would, propose that he doesn't commit an act of premeditated murder. He just wants to hit him, and the guy died, basically, and he buries him in right. And so the Goel Hadam there, in the accidental manslaughter, is none other than Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the one that wants to redeem the blood of the slain Egyptian, and therefore Moses has to run away. And he runs not to a city of refuge, he runs to a country of refuge where he becomes a shepherd. He doesn't live in a city. So that's number one. Number two item is that this also connects back to the beginning of the Torah, where we have the first story of fratricide, which arguably is also an act of manslaughter. It doesn't say that Cain wanted to kill Abel. When we put Cain on trial at camp, the kids always find Cain not guilty of first-degree murder, right? It's maybe manslaughter, and Cain has the same penalty. He becomes a wanderer, navanad. He has to be a vagrant wanderer in the land, but it's too great for him. So God places a sign on him, and then he lives in Eretz Nod and builds a city. So one could argue that the first city ever constructed was in fact a city of refuge. So I put those two things out and say that there are arcs here in the Torah where these stories connect back to earlier stories.
So, Elliot, that's a fascinating interpretation. But if the city of Nod is indeed a city of refuge, who is the Goel Adam?
Everybody. He's afraid that.
So then it's not fratricide, unless. So you're saying that everyone is Hevel's brother?
Yes, because the new generations, the new people that will come into existence are all going to be related to Hevel and want to avenge the death of Hevel.
Well, this part now makes it really deep. Like, okay, obviously neither Cain nor Moshe is really an accident. They might not be first-degree murder people, but they're not accidental ones either, because the point of the Goel Hadam, the Rosef Mishkaga, is that he really didn't intend to do this, and it was an accident, whereas those other two are much more like intentional crime. But what you say now is really just on a literary and spiritual level and poetic level, fabulous, because it like you said, it's an arc or a thread that takes these disparate episodes from the very, very, very beginning of the Torah, the very, very beginning of the book of Exodus, and now they just call them to mind in our ears again. And so if we want to make it like poetic, when God says to Cain, where's your brother? And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? And so your answer is on a deep spiritual, psychological level, you want it darker. All of us have some almost original obligation to avenge this first pointless murder in the world.
Yes.
And yet there is this amazing mercy that all the way back, the divine has, appointed some rescue for somebody who might otherwise just give up on their life.
So interestingly, that he's in perpetual exile, but once he says to God, "Gadol avani min sod," my punishment is too great for me to bear, he gets to settle. He's no longer wandering. He is nidui. He is cast out, which is really and here back to our accidental manslaughter in our Parsha, and of course in experience, that person is a kind of outcast. How could that person not be? I mean, a person who commits, this kind of, terrible event. I mean, how do you live with yourself after? It's impossible.
I just want to add something here so the question that Cain asked, am I my brother's keeper? What you're suggesting is the answer, properly understood, is everyone is your brother,
Yes.
and you are his keeper.
Yeah.
But Cain in the city remains in exile because we forget sometimes that he started off as a farmer.
Yeah.
And properly speaking, the city does not have farming the way that the farmer has farming.
Indeed. Wow.
And so he is still displaced. And for Adam, the land was going to bring forth thorns and thistles, but for Cain, it will no longer bring forth anything. Hence,
Right.
he's in the city, exiled to a city where he cannot sustain himself, and he's dependent on others.
Exactly. Wow. Well, we've reached our end of our
Can I
time.
just throw one more thing in there real
One more
quick,
thing.
which is that in the same spot here in the Torah, in 35, chapter Numbers 35, as Barry said, there's an idea that unjustly spilled blood pollutes the land, and that it has to be cleansed, and it really seems like it has to be cleansed with the execution of the murderer, unless it's determined to be an accident, in which case that blood did not really, pollute the land. It was just an accident. And the Torah in chapter 35, verses 31 and 32, there's something that's really, I think, important. Lo tikhu kofer lanefesh rotzeach asher hu rasha lamut ki mot yumat. Do not accept the ransom for the life of a murderer who has been judged, sentenced to death for capital punishment. Ki mot yumat, he must be put to death. Okay, we have lots of good reasons, and I think we should oppose the American death penalty. I think it's a terrible policy, very often, racially, socially imposed in prejudicial ways. But the Torah is saying something that I think we should hang on to, which is that there is no monetary fine, there's no monetary value that you can put on a life. Right. If you have killed somebody, you have taken something of infinite value, and you cannot say, okay, so you'll get out of the death penalty if you pay $1 million or $10 million or whatever it is. We do in the United States. We do have obviously civil damages for all kinds of things that people do, and people can in fact be imposed fines to pay the victims for pain and suffering, etc. But the deep insight is, as Maimonides says, with respect to that law about not taking a ransom to let somebody off the death penalty, is, even if the victim's family wants to, that life does not belong to the family. It belongs to God. And I think that's pretty deep. So the insistence on the death penalty for homicide, even though it's not what I would have for American society now, is gesturing toward the infinite value of human life. And I think that's a super important thing that emerges from the Torah.
That's another bow, another kind of arc in the Torah, which is the Torah starts really with understanding the Tzelem Elohim, the infinite value of life, and we're getting that echo here, and of course many echoes of lots of things. Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you especially Camp Ramah for broadcasting, and all the people that are listening there. We hope to see you next week, Bli Neder. In the meantime, we wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week on the next edition of Parasha Talk. Shabbat Shalom.